Story 1. The Disappearance at the Black Rose Motel. The Day of Disappearance. In 1997, 27-year-old Lisa Holmes set out for a short getaway in Arizona. She planned to spend the weekend alone, disconnecting from work and enjoying the quiet. Her final stop was at an old, rundown motel called the Black Rose. Lisa checked in around 9 p.m. The motel's elderly manager, Henry Crow, later confirmed that he had seen her that night. She bought a bottle of water, smiled at him, and headed to her room. The next morning, the housekeeper entered Lisa's room. The bed was made, and her belongings were gone. The only thing left was her phone on the table and the room key. Lisa had vanished. The investigation. The police found that Lisa had not officially checked out of the motel. Her car was still parked in the lot. Security footage showed Lisa entering her room, but there were no records of her leaving. Her phone didn't show any alarming messages. However, the detectives became suspicious of a strange detail. Just before 3 a.m., Lisa had attempted to call the emergency number, but the call lasted only 2 seconds. There were no signs of forced entry, and the room appeared undisturbed. But under the mattress, investigators discovered a small piece of paper with barely readable scribbles. Not sleeping, door. The resolution. A week later, a hunter stumbled upon Lisa's body. It was found in a dry ravine about 10 miles from the motel. The coroner determined she had died from asphyxiation. The prime suspect was Henry Crow. It turned out he had only worked at the motel for 3 months, but he had a previous conviction for assaulting a woman. However, there was not enough evidence to charge him. The case remained cold until 2003 when DNA testing revealed that skin found under Lisa's fingernails matched Henry Crow. By then, Crow was already in prison for a different crime. He was charged with Lisa's murder and received a life sentence. Story 2. The Sinister Tracks of Karen James. The beginning. Karen James was a 34-year-old woman, a mother of 2 and a successful entrepreneur. In 2014, she decided to take a short vacation to escape the daily grind of work and family life. Her husband stayed home with the children while Karen rented a secluded cabin in the Colorado mountains for some much-needed peace and quiet. Karen loved spending time alone and often used it to recharge and think. She rented a cabin deep in the mountains, miles away from civilization, for a weekend retreat. It was a peaceful, isolated place, far from the noise of the city. But when several days passed without word from Karen, her husband became concerned. At first, he thought she might just be enjoying herself, staying longer than expected. But when her phone went unanswered, he called the police. The investigation. The police tracked her car to a remote road leading to the mountains, but Karen was nowhere to be found. They found her vehicle abandoned on the side of the road. The search for her began immediately. Search teams combed the area, and after several days, they found something strange. A set of footprints leading into a dense forest, but no sign of Karen. Days later, her body was discovered in a hidden cave. She had been brutally beaten, and there were signs of torture. What disturbed the investigators was the complete lack of struggle. Karen seemed to have been ambushed while unsuspecting, and no one could explain how she ended up so far into the mountains. The suspect. As the investigation continued, police found out that Karen had recently been in contact with a man named Daniel Crow, who had just been released from prison after serving time for violent crimes. Crow had been staying in the area for a few weeks, but Crow denied any involvement in Karen's death. Despite his criminal history, there was no solid evidence to tie him to her murder. The case went cold, and no one was ever charged. Karen's death remained an unsolved mystery, and her family was left to wonder who was responsible for the brutal crime that took her life. Story 3. The Vanishing of Tanya Miller. The night Tanya disappeared. Tanya Miller was a 19-year-old college student who lived in a small town. In the summer of 2012, she decided to spend a night out with her best friend at a local bar. Little did she know, that night would mark her last known moments. Tanya and her friend arrived at the bar around 9 p.m. The place was packed with other students and locals. Tanya, known for her outgoing personality, was quickly caught up in conversation with a man she had never met before. They hit it off and talked for several hours. At some point, Tanya's friend went to the restroom. When she returned, Tanya was nowhere to be found. Her phone was off and she had left no message. The investigation. The next morning, Tanya's parents were frantic. They called her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. Tanya's friend told the police that she had last seen Tanya with a man in the bar, but after that, she had disappeared. The police investigated the bar's security footage, which confirmed that Tanya had been talking to the man. The footage also showed that she left with him around 2 a.m., but after that, she vanished. Tanya's car was still parked outside the bar, and the man she had been speaking to was identified as 35-year-old Jonathan Hart, a man with a criminal record for violent behavior. Hart denied any involvement in Tanya's disappearance, claiming that he had left the bar alone after their conversation. The discovery. Days later, Tanya's body was found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. She had been severely beaten, and there were no signs of struggle. An autopsy revealed that Tanya had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators were convinced that Jonathan Hart was involved, but despite numerous interrogations, they couldn't prove it. The case remained unsolved for several years. Jonathan Hart was never charged, and Tanya Miller's family was left without answers. Her disappearance became one of the most haunting and unresolved cases in the town's history. Story 4. The Murder of Heather Rose. The Disappearance. On a cold night in November 2010, 24-year-old Heather Rose, a popular local bartender in Portland, Oregon, left her shift at the bar and was last seen walking to her car. Heather had been working late, as usual, but when she didn't come home that night, her roommates grew worried. The next morning, Heather's car was found parked near a dimly lit alley a few blocks from her apartment. The keys were in the ignition, and the door was unlocked. The police were immediately alerted, and a search for Heather began. The investigation. Detectives interviewed her co-workers, friends, and family, but no one could explain where she had gone. There were no signs of struggle, and no one had witnessed her leaving the bar with anyone. Police examined the area around her car and found a broken necklace, one Heather often wore. Security footage from nearby cameras showed Heather leaving the bar, but there was something odd about the footage. A man appeared to be following her from a distance. The breakthrough. After days of searching, the police received an anonymous tip that led them to a nearby abandoned warehouse. Inside, they discovered Heather's lifeless body, hidden in a pile of old furniture. She had been brutally beaten, and a large amount of her jewelry was missing. A trace of DNA was found under her fingernails, which led investigators to a man named Eric Holt. He was a regular at the bar where Heather worked and had a history of violence. After questioning him, it was discovered that Heather had rejected his advances a few days before her disappearance. Holt had been stalking her since. The arrest and trial. Eric Holt was arrested for the murder of Heather Rose. The trial revealed that after Heather had rejected him, he had become fixated on her. On the night of her disappearance, he had followed her to the alley and attacked her when she tried to get into her car. After killing her, he stole her jewelry to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Eric Holt was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case remains a haunting reminder of how obsession can turn deadly. Story 5. The Secret Life of Danielle Simmons. The Missing Woman. In 2008, 35-year-old Sarah Whitmore, a mother of two, vanished without a trace. She had been living in a small town in Illinois with her husband, Danielle Simmons, and their children. The day she disappeared, Daniel reported her missing, claiming that she had left the house without telling him where she was going. He said she had taken her car, but he didn't know why she would leave her children behind. When Sarah's friends and family were questioned, they revealed that she had been planning to leave Daniel. Her friends had noticed that Sarah seemed unhappy in her marriage and had even confided in them about Daniel's violent behavior. They said that Sarah had been planning to seek a divorce. The investigation. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to suspect Daniel. He seemed calm and collected, but his story didn't add up. Police learned that Daniel had a criminal record for assault and they found out that he had a history of controlling behavior towards Sarah. When police searched the home, they found bloodstains in the basement. Daniel explained them away as a minor accident, but investigators weren't convinced. The discovery. Several weeks later, police uncovered a hidden room in the basement of Daniel's house. Inside, they found Sarah's body, hidden behind a false wall. She had been strangled, and there were signs of physical abuse. Further investigation revealed that Daniel had been planning to kill Sarah for months, and had been using his charm to throw off suspicion. It was revealed that Daniel had been living a double life. While publicly presenting himself as a loving husband, he had been carrying out a series of secret affairs and abusive acts behind Sarah's back. The conviction. Daniel Simmons was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, the jury was shown evidence of his manipulative behavior and violent tendencies. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case shocked the community, and it served as a chilling reminder of how someone could hide their true nature behind a facade of normalcy. Story 6. The Disappearance of Mark Taylor. The Vanishing. Mark Taylor, a 45-year-old businessman from Los Angeles, vanished in 2015. He was a successful entrepreneur who had built his company from the ground up. Mark's wife, Amy, was the first to report him missing. She claimed that he had left for a business meeting early in the morning but never returned. His car was found parked near a local cafe, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. Friends and colleagues were baffled. Mark had no known enemies, and there were no signs of any financial troubles. Amy appeared to be genuinely worried about her husband's disappearance, but something about the situation seemed off. The investigation. The police began their investigation by interviewing Amy and Mark's business partners. While they couldn't find anyone who had any obvious motive to harm Mark, they did uncover something suspicious. Amy had recently taken out a life insurance policy on Mark worth $2 million. The authorities also found surveillance footage of Mark leaving the cafe, but the footage ended abruptly, as though the cameras had been tampered with. The breakthrough. After several months of searching, the case took a surprising turn. In a remote area, investigators found Mark's body buried in a shallow grave. His hands had been tied, and he had been shot in the back of the head. There were no signs of a struggle, suggesting that he had been ambushed. A forensic analysis of his body revealed that Mark had been dead for several weeks before his body was discovered. Investigators soon learned that Amy had been in contact with a man named George Mitchell, a former employee of Mark's who had been fired months earlier for embezzlement. The arrest. It turned out that Amy and George had been having an affair, and together they had planned Mark's murder. Amy had been looking for a way to collect the life insurance money, and George had agreed to help her. Both Amy and George were arrested and charged with murder. During the trial, Amy's cold demeanor and the evidence against her were overwhelming. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. George was also convicted and received a 40-year sentence. The case was a tragic reminder of how greed and betrayal can destroy lives, even within a seemingly perfect family.